Well, let's start with prayer. Our dear Heavenly Father, I want to thank you for allowing us to come together and study the book of Acts and look at the development of the early church, Lord, and how it can apply to our lives today and how we can grow the church. And let us take these lessons, Lord, and study and really understand the message that you have recorded for us. And I thank you in the name of your Son, Yeshua. Amen. So, my marker, there we go. So we're in Acts 23 today. It's not a real long one either, like Gordon's last week, though I'm going to back up and like Gordon started back a little bit, and then we're going to work our way forward. But we're going to start right here. I'll read the first one. We've got 6 people total right now. So if everybody will just take one, that would be awesome. Acts 23, and looking intently at the council, Paul said, "Brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day." And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. And then Paul said to him, "God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law? And yet, contrary to the law, you order me to be struck?"
Those who stood by said, "Would you revile God's high priest?" And Paul said, "I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people." Now when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, "Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial."
And when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. Then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisee party stood up and contended sharply, "We find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or an angel spoke to him?"
And when the dissension became violent, the tribune, afraid of Paul would be torn to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him away from among them by force and bring him into the barracks. The following night, the Lord stood by him and said, "Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome."
When it was day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who made this conspiracy. When they went to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food till we have killed Paul. Now therefore you, along with the council, give notice to the tribune to bring him down to you."
As though you were going to determine his case more exactly, and we are ready to kill him before he comes near. Now the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, so he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to tell him." So he took him and brought him to the tribune and said,
"Paul, the prisoner, called me and asked me to bring this young man to you, as he has something to say to you." The tribune took him by the hand and, going aside, asked him privately, "What is it you have to tell me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more closely about him."
But do not be persuaded by them, for more than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him, who have bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they've killed him. And now they are ready, waiting for your consent. So the tribune dismissed the young man, charging him, "Tell no one that you have informed me of these things."
Then he called 2 of the centurions and said, "Get ready 200 soldiers with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen to go as far as Caesarea at the 3rd hour of the night. Also, provide mounts for Paul to ride and bring him safely to Felix the governor. And he wrote the letter to this effect: Claudius Lysias, to his excellency, the governor, Felix, greetings.
This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when I came upon them with the soldiers and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman citizen. And desiring to know the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. I found that he was being accused about questions of their law, but charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment.
And when it was disclosed to me that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against him. So the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. And on the next day they returned to the barracks, letting the horsemen go on with him.
When they'd come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul also before him. On reading the letter, he asked him what province he was from. And when he learned he was from Caesarea, he said, I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. And he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. And that is where it ends. So the map we're looking at right here, I put a blue line. Jerusalem is where this all starts at. And he goes all the way up and across to Antipatris and then up to Caesarea, which I marked in blue at the very top, right up along the coastline. And we're going to talk about this route is important to the story and why it is. But I want to go back and pick up something in Acts 22 because I did listen to Gordon's talk last week, and there were some questions that people had, and I have a few things that tools that Gordon doesn't have. So it gives me a little different insight. When he talks about his encounter, and he said, go, and I will send you far away to the Gentiles. Then they raised up their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth. He should not be allowed to live. And the question was asked or stated, why did he say this? Why did they come out like this? And why did they start doing what they did? Well, you have to go back to Joshua. Joshua 23:10. 12 through 13 says, so that you associate with them and they with you, know for certain the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you, but they will be a snare and a trap for you, a whip on your sides and thorns in your eyes until you perish, and from this good ground that the Lord has given you. So Joshua was talking to the people right when he was about to die. It was 100 and something. And he was telling them not to associate with anybody else. And if you remember from when we were earlier in Acts, when Peter was talking about that we weren't to associate, and that came from Jubilees. And do you, my son Jacob, remember my words and observe my commandments of Adam, your father? Separate yourself from the nations. Do not eat with them. Do not according to their works, or become their associate. For they are unclean, and all their ways are a pollution and an abomination and uncleanness. So here we have two foundational verses that were present. Now, Jubilees, most people, they're not in part of the canon, either the Hebrew canon or I should rephrase that. In the Protestant canon, they are in the Roman Catholic canon, the Jubilees is. But when we look at it, it didn't just stop with these two verses, because we see in Matthew 10:5, Jesus said, go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And when he was questioned, he said, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And then we come back to Acts 10, where Peter went and found many persons, and he said, you yourselves know how unlawful it is for a Jew to associate with or visit anyone of another nation. So this was the reason why they got upset. They already knew all this, not including this New Testament section that I put in here. I just put that to show the continuity, that was the thought pattern of people in the first century. And they were basing that on Joshua's discussion. And why did they throw dirt? Because as they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and clinging dust into the air. Well, again, when you look at the Hebrew, it's ayin pei resh. Ayin pei resh is dirt or dust. And so if you use a typical translation software and you try to do a word search, a lot of times it won't show it because you have 6 words to choose from. But in Job 2:11 and 12, they made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and comfort him. Remember, this is his friends coming to see Job. And when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him. And they raised their voices and wept. They tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads towards heaven. In other words, they threw dust in the air. And then Joshua 7:1-6. But the people of Israel broke faith in regard to the devoted things. Joshua tore his clothes, fell on the earth on his face before the ark of the God until evening, and he and the elders put dust on their heads. So again, here's a situation where they are throwing dust. But there are other supporting verses with that. The practice of throwing dust upon one's head actually predates the writing of the Bible by several centuries, appearing in the pyramid text of Egypt from the pyramid of Pepe II. These writings date to around 2278 BC. And though female funerary priests had an important role in the funerary cult, the main role for a woman at the burial was that of a professional mourner. They were hired for royal and noble funerals to throw dust over their heads, tear at their clothes, scratch their cheeks, wail, and expose their breasts. There are other verses that also show this happening. Lamentations 2:10. The elders of Zion sit on the ground in silence. They have thrown dust on their heads. And finally, this is one from Sefer HaYasher, which is a Targum on Genesis 34:27. And then the sons of Jacob returned among the slain and took all the spoil that was found in the city. This was the 2 sons going and killed all the men. And while they were engaging in taking the spoil, some 300 women stood up throwing dust at them. Now, if you turn to Genesis 34:27, it doesn't say that exactly. This is an addition when they moved it from Hebrew to Aramaic and they threw this in here. So here we see Paul, by his statement, was going to the Gentiles, which was prohibited in the Torah and the writings. And when in distress or mourning, it was customary to take off their clothing and throw dust in the air or put it on their heads. Intentional breaking of the covenant with God, i.e. the Torah, would have, as did Joshua, been protested in this manner. So this is kind of an explanation for why that happened. The second thing that on Acts 22, the tribune ordered him to be brought to the barracks, saying he should be examined by flogging. Paul said the centurion was standing by. Is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman citizen or condemned and on condemned? Well, following the 2nd century BCE porcine rules, a Roman citizen could not be tortured or whipped and could commute a sentence of death to voluntary exile unless he was found guilty of treason. So guilty of treason means the reason why we see Paul and Peter getting executed, Peter wasn't not a Roman citizen, but Paul was, is that Paul, if you say Caesar by Roman dictate was God, if you say that there is a God other than Caesar, then you are guilty of treason. So if accused of treason, a Roman citizen had the right to be tried in Rome, which is why they took Paul to Rome. And even if sentenced to death, no Roman citizen could be sentenced to crucifixion. As Gordon mentioned last week, most often they were beheaded. But if the emperor was really upset with him, he could strip their citizenship. And they had a most for people that committed treason. They would, I thought this was just an interesting sideline. They would take a leather bag big enough to put a human being in, and a snake, and a dog and a jaguar, tie it shut and throw it in the river. Well, that'd be a very painful last few hours or minutes until you either got bit by a viper, clawed to death by a cat, or killed by the dog. Not a good way to die. I think I'd take the crucifixion over that one. But this kind of gives you a little bit more of understanding of it. And the final thing I want to point out, tell me, are you a Roman citizen? He said, yes. The tribune answered, I bought the citizenship for a large sum. Paul said, but I am a citizen by birth. And the tribune also was afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and he had bound him. Well, the reason he's afraid is because if you, being of lesser station, harm a person of higher station, you are given the punishment that you were given to that person and could be put to death because of it. To be born as a citizen required that both parents be free citizens of Rome. Okay, both parents. So Paul's parents, not only were they born in a Roman territory, not even an outskirt, but they were a Roman citizen. They both had to be fairly wealthy in order to be citizenship. You could become a citizenship if you did public service, such as serving in the military or any of the other non-Roman citizens. By grant from a person or general or emperor, they could give you citizenship. By purchasing citizenship, which is what he talked about, a very expensive process. The more you paid, the higher your level of citizenship, basic bribery, right? In total, there were 5 levels of citizenship in the Roman Empire, and each had a various right based upon your station, with a native born being awarded the greatest amount of rights, which is why this individual was so afraid, because he realized he had bought a citizenship. He's number 4 down the line. Paul's number 1. If the emperor found out about it, he would probably have been executed on the spot because he was attacking a Roman citizen. So that's just a few points I wanted to clarify about 22. And then we want to go into 23. Okay, so Acts 23. The high priest commanded those who stood by him to strike him. And Paul said, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Right? Why did Paul call him a whitewashed wall? Well, by calling the high priest a whitewashed wall, Paul was calling Ananias a hypocrite for commanding other people to do his dirty work. At the hearing, supposedly aimed to upholding justice, he was telling others to inflict bodily harm on Paul, who hadn't been found guilty. In order to give a Jew punishment, they had to be found guilty in the court of law, or in this case, the Sanhedrin. They had to be found guilty. Otherwise, you were not allowed to lay a hand on them. So then it goes, are you sending to judge me according to the law? Yet contrary to the law, you order me to be struck. And here is where it comes from. If there's a dispute between men and they come into court and the judge decides between them, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty, then if the guilty man deserves to be beaten, the judge shall cause him to lie down and be beaten in his presence. So the person has to be found guilty of guilt before that happens. And then we get to the other side of the coin. And they said, would you revile God's high priest? Paul said, I did not know, brothers, that he was a high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. Where was Paul quoting from? Well, he was quoting from Exodus 22:28. You shall not revile God, nor curse a ruler of your people. So Paul was very aware of the law. And the question that comes to mind immediately, who was Ananias and why did Paul not recognize him? Well, first off, the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. And Josephus, called Ananias ben Nebius, he officiated a high priest from CE 47 to 52. When was Paul in Jerusalem? When did he start if we think back to the stoning of Stephen, that was in 33, right? So Paul had already been on these missionary journeys. The high priest had changed in that time. As a matter of fact, Josephus speaks very poorly about this particular high priest because, according to Josephus, he bought the position of high priest from the Romans. So he's not very well liked. He wasn't thought of very well by the Jewish people, and it was a problem. And so here he has struck him. He did what was wrong, and Paul quoted it back. And Paul was very smart in how he handled this, because when Paul perceived that one part of them were Sadducees and the other part were Pharisees, they cried out in council, "Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees." So not only is he a Roman citizen, he is claiming that not only is he a Pharisee, but that his parents were Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. So that's his defense. Now, what about the Pharisees and the Sadducees? Well, first off, the Pharisees, their most distinguishing characteristic was a belief in the oral Torah, which is passed down to today, that God gave to Moses at Sinai along with the Torah. They maintained an afterlife existed and that God punished the wicked and rewarded the righteous in the world to come. They also believed a Messiah who would herald an era of world peace. They started the synagogal system. The synagogal system did not exist prior in any form prior to the Second Temple. There was a little scattering of synagogues, maybe, but it's disputed whether they waited until the actual temple fell the second time. But we know that there were schools because we had the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. So we do know that. They were also much more liberal in their interpretation of Torah. The Sadducees, they were Sadducees, were elitists who wanted to maintain the priestly caste, but they were also liberal in their willingness to incorporate Hellenism into their lives, which the Pharisees were strongly opposed to. They rejected the idea of the oral Torah and insisted on a literal interpretation of the written law. They did not believe in an afterlife or a resurrection, since it's not mentioned in the Torah. And the focus of Sadducean life was rituals associated with the Torah, with the temple. So, in looking at these two classifications, and when we look at this, we see very clearly that Yeshua falls in the Pharisaical camp. Obviously he spoke about the Torah, but he also made comments that were listed in the oral Torah, though it wasn't written down at the time that Yeshua was there on earth. It didn't get written down until 100 years after the temple. He obviously believed in an afterlife. He believed in a Messiah. And his interpretation, in most cases, was sometimes he tightened Torah, sometimes he loosened Torah. Depends on what he talks about, right? He was not wrapped into the temple system, though he went to the temple, obviously. There's many examples of him going to the temple, and the disciples also continued it. So there's some big differences, and Paul put in there, look, I believe in the resurrection, and the Sadducees got mad, and then they started the fight between the two of them, which Paul's standing in the middle of these guys fighting because they're in a semicircle. The Sanhedrin was a semicircle and the person stood in the dead center, and not a good place to be in the middle of a fight. So Paul was then taken. We remember he was taken by the Romans and he was held at the barracks. He was undoubtedly discouraged, right? He just had been threatened. He had been struck by the high priest. But the Lord stood by him and said, take courage, for as you have testified to the facts of me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome. So he knew that he was not going to die in Jerusalem, right? The Lord had told him he would testify in Rome. And that's something we need to keep in mind. God has his time and place, not man, right? They can do all the threatening they want, but God has his time and place. And the Jews went and made a plot and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. They went to the high priest and the elders and said, we have strictly bound ourselves by an oath. Well, here's a problem for them, because it says, when you make a vow to God, not vow to your God, do not put off fulfilling it, for your God will require it of you, and you will have incurred guilt. You must fulfill what has crossed your lips and perform what you have voluntarily vowed to your God, having made the promise with your own mouth. So now these 40 plus people had made a vow to kill Paul. And I always come back to at the end and go, well, wait a minute, they didn't fulfill their vow. Why didn't they have something happen to him? Well, we don't know what happened to him because of who the high priest was. He probably absolved them of it, made them do a penance, or we don't know exactly. I doubt very much they committed suicide or were put to death, because what they did was not a death-worthy thing, but it would have definitely been a situation of having to pay a fine. So, continuing on, it talks about the son of Paul's sisters heard of their ambush, so he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. That brought me to two questions. We only hear about Paul's family a few times in the New Testament. We know he obviously had a father and a mother, otherwise he wouldn't exist. He had a sister. He had a nephew. And Romans 16 also mentions one woman and 5 women. The Greek term is sojourneys, which means they are intimately related to him. It is not I had to look this one up because I don't know Greek at all. I had to look it up. And so it is quite possible that Paul had 2 sisters and 5 brothers, but we don't hear about them specifically. The only people we hear about specifically is the sister and the nephew. And of course, he makes reference to his mother and father. Now, the question is, how did the young man get to the barracks, right? How is a young man going to go to the barracks? Well, in those days, family were required to supply food for the prisoners. Otherwise, they starved to death. And that happened to many, many prisoners. If they had no family, or the family was too poor to feed the person in prison, they would starve to death, because that was a requirement in the Roman government. Now, Paul's nephew also was very young. And why do I say that? Well, because verse 19 says the tribune took him by the hand and then took him into a separate area to talk to him quietly. He wouldn't do that if he was a full-grown man. Obviously, the tribune wouldn't. It was the fact that this was a young man, and he was probably delivering the food, and he overheard what was going on as far as the plans. So we know that his nephew was relatively young when he went there. Now, the reaction of the tribune was he called 2 of the centurions and said, get ready, 200 soldiers with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen, and provide mounts for Paul. And they were to go as far as Caesarea on the 3rd night. Well, think about that. 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen. That's 472 soldiers, because there's 2 centurions to protect Paul. That is not a basic honor guard. That's a whole company. The Roman soldiers could average 20 miles a day with all their equipment walking. So when we talk about where they went first, it was actually 25 miles, and we'll look at that. But they left it in the 3rd hour. And the 3rd hour of the night, would have been 9 o'clock at night. So they're walking in the dark. In the third hour of the night, the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. And on the next day, they returned to their barracks, letting the horsemen go on with them. So they went prepared to be attacked, right? But this is what made the Romans so powerful. If you look at this is a picture on the right-hand side of your screen. You see the shields put in interlocking, and then the spearmen stood there. The spears were to stop horsemen, right? They angle them up. If the horse runs into them, they die. The people holding the shields carried the short sword. They had this special sword that they used, extremely effective, the most efficient fighting force the world had ever known up to that point. So they started at 9 o'clock at night and likely marched all night, 25 miles. That would have put them, they could average 20 miles a day, taking 6.5 about hours. So they probably marched until almost 6 in the morning, and they made camp. And then the road from Jerusalem to Antipatris was through the mountains and the highest chance of ambush. Once you get to Antipatris, it's a straight line up the coast. It's a Roman-built highway that's still there today, and it is with horse. You could run it in a matter of a few hours.
You'll have to repeat that part on the road because you totally faded out.
Oh, did I?
Yeah.
So the road from Jerusalem to Antipatris was through the mountains, and it was about 25 miles, and it was where the chance of an ambush, which is why there were 200 soldiers and 200 spearmen and 70 horses plus 2 centurions. And they would be able to make this formation should they be attacked. Almost impossible to get through. And they could walk that way. They trained so they could walk that way. So they get there, and then the soldiers and the spearmen walk back, right? And they probably slept all day and then walked that back that night, or maybe late afternoon. And then the soldiers, the horsemen, ride on with Paul. What's interesting is that Paul is provided with 2 horses, right? That means he can switch horses, so his horse never gets tired if they end up in trouble. But he had 70 horsemen to escort in that last little bit up to Caesarea. What I found was interesting. If you read Acts 23 and you read this letter, you remember what happened in Acts 21, 22, and 23 leading up to it. Tell me if this letter jives with what we just read. He wrote a letter to this effect. I gave his greeting. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when I came upon them with soldiers and rescued him, having learned he was a Roman citizen. Did he know he was a Roman citizen before he took him prisoner? No, because he was going to whip him, right?
Yeah, he's trying to cover himself.
And desiring to know the charge for which is accused him, I brought him down to their council. I found he was being accused about questions about their law, but charged with nothing deserving of death or imprisonment. And when it was disclosed to me that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against him. Well, there's a few problems with this whole letter. This whole letter is very self-serving, and here's the men themselves: Claudius Lysias and Governor Felix, right? They still have stone effigies of these guys that have survived over the years. The problem with the letter, it says this man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when he came upon them. He didn't come upon them. They made noise and he came down to see what was going on. Then he took him away. But it wasn't like he was wandering. I rescued him, having learned he was a Roman citizen. No, he didn't know he was a Roman citizen until after he got him and was going to have him flogged. I found that he was being accused about questions of their law, but charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. So here's the problem they have. They never really went into that other than the fact that they were having a fight about it. And remember, the Pharisees said they found no fault in this man, where the Sadducees said that it was a problem. I ordered his accusers also to state before you and what they have against him. Well, here's the deal. If that is in fact the case, this whole letter, let's look a little bit more about that statement here. So they arrive in Caesarea, and one of the centurions, probably one went back with the soldiers, one went forward. That would be logical because you have to have somebody to lead the 400 men back. They delivered the letter to Felix. They presented Paul to the governor. And after reading the letter, he asked what province Paul was from. Why did he do that? Well, because it's a cop-out for him. If he's not in a district that he's in control of. So remember, the individual, Felix, was the governor of the whole region. So he was responsible for a region. But if Paul was a Roman citizen from, let's say, Rome, it wouldn't be his problem. He could just ship him on to the next guy. But because he was from Galatia, he had to, from Sicilia, he had to oversee the trial. So when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. Now remember that the letter said he had sent them right away. Well, they didn't arrive we're going to see that in the next one. They're not going to arrive for another 5 days. So once he said it, that, and when we should do 24, you're going to see that. Well, then he commanded the guard commanded him to be guarded in Herod's Praetorium. Now, the Praetorium is a very large building. This is actual picture of the actual Praetorium that Paul was kept in. It's still, the foundation still exists, and they architecturally redrew it. The Latin term for Praetorium originally identified the tent of a general within a Roman encampment, but again, they became a regular fortified little city. 600 soldiers are stationed there, and it acted as a court for the regional area. So this is why Felix was here in Caesarea, and he was the court. He held the court for the whole area. And this is where Paul was held until he shipped on to Rome. We're going to look at that. So we're looking at a very interesting section of his journey. And it was interesting to look at some of the dialogue concerning the law and who was guilty of what. Anybody have any questions? Okay, that's it for tonight. Next week, we go on to 24. We're only 4 chapters from the end of Acts. So we're winding our way through it. Yes, Eli.
Did you, was it clarified whether the priests took off their garments or tore their garments?
It wasn't the priest, actually. The high priest didn't take off his garments. The members of the court, the Sanhedrin, it says in Acts that they took off their garments, but it's still in other verses in the Bible, it says they took off their garment. And basically, you got to think about it, they were probably wearing a tallit, a large tallit, and they just throw it to the ground in anger and disgust. And in this case, they're mad because he's saying he's just going to go ahead and break. And it's what I would call righteous indignation, right? They're acting all upset and hurt and mad and acting out. They're acting out in a manner that was done in the Torah. So nobody can say, "Oh, you can't do that." Well, they could, but again, they were not innocent, as Paul called him. You're not innocent. You had me struck first, and they didn't just slap him. They probably had somebody fairly large hit him hard, right? So they were making punishment of him. Okay, let's end with a word of prayer then. Our dear Father in heaven, I want to thank you for allowing us to be here and spend time in your word, Lord. Allow us to understand the ramifications and the interplay that went on to bring it to life in our life today, and how we can use that, even though we're treated wrongly, that we can use what is used against us and in a way that glorifies you. And I thank you in the name of your son, Yeshua. Amen.